The orange autumn sky covered Dublin's Central Park as Connor walked with his hands in his pockets, his footsteps echoing in the dry leaves scattered on the ground. It was the kind of afternoon he usually avoided, with its melancholy painted in autumn colors, but something about the stillness made him feel less lost. He walked aimlessly, observing families, joggers, and people walking their dogs. In the distance, a movement among the trees caught his eye. Small, agile, and curious, a German Shepherd puppy was wedged between dense bushes, shaking its head as it tried to free itself. Connor hesitated for a moment. The owner is probably nearby, he thought, but when he looked around, he didn't see anyone who seemed responsible for him. He approached slowly, crouching down so as not to frighten the cub. "Hey, kid," he murmured in a gentle voice, holding out his hand. The dog, initially tense, wagged its tail cautiously and hesitantly moved forward. When their eyes met, there seemed to be a kind of mutual understanding. The puppy licked Connor's fingers and, in return, got a pat behind the ears. For a few moments, Connor forgot the world. The innocent, vulnerable expression on the puppy's face reminded him of something he had been trying to forget for a long time. But then, reality brought him back. He stood up, looking around again. "Where's your master?" he asked. But the puppy just tilted his head, as if he understood the question, but didn't have an answer. He decided to wait. He sat down on a nearby bench, with the puppy by his side. 15 minutes passed, then half an hour. No one appeared. The puppy seemed comfortable, leaning against Connor's feet and falling asleep right there. Something inside Connor began to change at that moment. It was as if that little being had decided that he, and not someone else, was its refuge. He looked at the puppy, who was now snoring softly. "I guess it's just you and me, huh?" he said, smiling for the first time in weeks. Connor took the puppy on his lap, feeling the warmth of the little body against his own. He started walking towards his apartment, aware that his life had just taken an unexpected turn. This was the birth of a connection that would change everything. Connor entered his small apartment on the 3rd floor, carrying the sleeping puppy in his arms. As soon as he put the dog down, it woke up, sniffing the air and inspecting its surroundings with curiosity. Connor bent down to take off his shoes while observing the animal's renewed energy. "Looks like you're home now, doesn't it?" he commented, smiling as he watched him explore every corner. Connor didn't have much. A living room with simple furniture, a battered sofa, and a table full of crumpled papers. When the puppy tried to nibble one of the papers, he laughed for the first time in months. "Hey, kid, that's not a toy." He picked up the paper and replaced it with an old sock that was lying on the floor. The dog grabbed the sock and started chewing on it enthusiastically. After a few hours of interaction, the inevitable question came to Connor's mind. What would he do with it? He spent the rest of the night checking local social media groups and posting an announcement. "German Shepherd puppy found in Parque Central. Contact Connor." With no immediate response, he sighed, closed his laptop, and watched the puppy, who was now curled up in a corner, sleeping again. "Guess you don't have anyone, huh?" he muttered, feeling a tightness in his chest. The next morning, Connor woke up to the sound of paws slipping on the kitchen floor. On entering, he found the puppy trying to reach the bread he had left on the edge of the table. Connor couldn't help laughing. "Right, you must be hungry. Let's sort this out." He prepared a bowl with milk and pieces of bread, and the dog devoured everything in seconds. As he watched, Connor realized that for the first time, the loneliness that had accompanied him since the death of his fiancée Emma seemed less suffocating. Something about that little being brought life to the oppressive silence of his apartment. "I think I need to give you a name, don't you?" he said, leaning over to stroke the dog. "How about Faithful? It suits you." The puppy barked once, as if in approval, and wagged his tail. The decision was made. Over the next few days, Feel quickly became an integral part of Connor's routine. In the morning, he would accompany Connor to the cafe on the corner, where the barista with the shy smile always asked about the dog. "He's adorable." "What's his name?" she asked. "Faithful, because he won't let me go," Connor replied with a light laugh, feeling more at ease in their conversations than he had for a long time. Phil also quickly learned the habits of the house. He would sit next to Connor while he revised documents on the computer or read on the sofa. Sometimes he put his head in his lap, demanding attention. One day, during a walk in the park, Connor decided to try to teach him a few tricks. He picked up a small branch and threw it in front of him. "Go, Faithful, fetch!" The puppy ran off, but instead of bringing the branch back, he started playing with it. Connor laughed, shouting, "You don't understand the concept, but that's okay." The bond between them only grew. Phil seemed to be able to sense Connor's moods, remaining calm on quiet days or getting excited to play when he felt lighter. Little by little, the apartment was no longer just a lonely abode, but a home full of movement and warmth. But something hung over Connor like a shadow. In moments of introspection, he wondered if he really had the ability to look after Phil. His life was chaotic enough. The puppy needed more attention, and he feared he wasn't up to the task. Even so, every day at Phil's side filled an emptiness that Connor couldn't explain. As he watched the puppy sleeping on his sofa, wrapped in a blanket that had once belonged to Emma, Connor felt something he hadn't felt for a long time: hope. The weeks passed, and Faithful became a constant presence in Connor's life. Daily walks, lazy afternoons on the sofa, and playing in the park became a welcome relief to the sadness he carried. But along with the joy came doubts. That night, Connor was sitting on the floor of his small apartment, with Phil lying next to him, nibbling on a toy bone he had bought at the market. The sound of the puppy's jaws filled the silence, but Connor's mind was racing. "Faithful, he began, but the words disappeared down his throat. The dog looked at him, tilting its head, as if it understood the anguish in his voice. Connor was going through a personal storm. His job as a financial analyst, which he had already found unbearable, now demanded increasingly long and tiring hours. His boss, rigid and merciless, would not tolerate failure. Worse still, he received constant notices of rent arrears, and his savings were almost gone. As Phil licked his hand, oblivious to his owner's internal conflict, Connor sighed, feeling overwhelmed by a wave of guilt. "You deserve better than that, kid. More than a guy who can barely pay for his food." He ran his hand through Phil's soft fur, and he wagged his tail in response. Over the next few days, the idea began to take shape in Connor's mind, despite every fiber of his being fighting against it. He started looking for information about shelters in the city. His searches led him to adoption pages and accounts of owners who, however much they loved their animals, believed they were doing the right thing by leaving them in more appropriate care. Connor wondered if that was what he should do. That Friday, after a particularly exhausting week, Connor made his decision. He would spend one more night with Phil before going ahead with his plan. Trying to dispel the sadness, he decided to cook something special for them: a simple grilled chicken. "Look, kid, it's nothing gourmet, but it's what we've got." He shared a piece with Phil, who devoured it with enthusiasm. Connor laughed softly, but his eyes were watery. During the night, Phil jumped into bed, as he always did, and settled down next to Connor. The warmth of her little body was comforting, but it made the pain of the decision sting even more. The next morning, Connor prepared to carry out his plan. He put Faithful in the car, along with his favorite blanket and bowl of food. He had chosen a quiet park on the outskirts of the city, a place with open space and frequented by many families. As he drove, the silence in the car was unbearable. Phil was in the passenger seat, staring out of the window, with no idea what was about to happen. Connor felt his hands sweat on the steering wheel, and with every kilometer, his breathing seemed heavier. When they reached the park, Connor parked the car and got out, with Phil following happily at his side. They walked for a few minutes until they reached a more secluded area. The distant sound of children playing and birds singing seemed a cruel contrast to what Connor was about to do. He stopped and knelt down, holding Phil's face with his hands. The dog licked his fingers, unaware of Connor's dark gaze. "You deserve someone better than me, kid. Someone who has time and who can take care of you like you deserve." His voice trembled, and he felt the knot in his throat tighten with every word. Connor pulled away slowly, trying to control the tears that threatened to overflow. He put the blanket on the floor, along with the bowl of water and a small bag of food. Faithful looked at him, confused, but remained still, wagging his tail as if he hoped this was just another game. Unable to look back, Connor started walking back to the car. His chest was heavy, and each step seemed to take a part of his soul. As he opened the car door, he heard a yelp. He turned and saw Phil running towards him, the blanket dragging behind him. "No, Phil," Connor said firmly, trying to push him away, but the dog continued to follow him, his gaze full of loyalty and confusion. The scene was devastating. Connor got into the car and closed the door, holding back tears as he saw Phil sitting outside, looking at him with bright, trusting eyes. He started the car and began to drive, but in the rearview mirror, Phil was still there, standing there, watching. "Forgive me," whispered Connor, as the weight of what he had just done crushed him inside. The car slid down the road as Connor drove, his eyes fixed on the horizon, but his mind miles away. The silence in the car was unbearable, filled only by the sound of the engine and the echo of his conscience shouting that he had made an irreparable mistake. He clutched the steering wheel, trying to ignore the emptiness spreading inside. The image of Phil, sitting in the park, looking at him with those innocent, loyal eyes, was etched in his mind. A tear trickled down, but he wiped it away quickly. It was the right thing to do, he repeated to himself, as if trying to convince himself would ease the pain. The road became more winding as Connor headed towards the city center. The sunlight was beginning to fade, and the night brought with it a fine mist that covered the asphalt. He was distracted, lost in thought, when the sound of skidding tires cut through the air. "No!" shouted Connor, instinctively pulling on the steering wheel, but it was too late. The car skidded around a sharp bend, hit the guardrail, and overturned, ending up on its side in a shallow ditch by the side of the road. Silence returned, interrupted only by the sound of creaking metal and the slow drip of the damaged radiator. Inside the car, Connor was trapped. His head throbbed and he felt a sharp pain in his leg, which was trapped between the seat and the dented dashboard. He reached for his cell phone, but it was out of reach. Every attempt to move resulted in more pain. He was breathing hard as the darkness around him seemed to grow denser and denser. Miles away, Phil was sitting exactly where Connor had left him, looking in the direction in which the car had disappeared. But something inside him changed. The puppy suddenly stood up, ears alert, as if he had sensed something was wrong. He sniffed the air, turned in restless circles, and then shot off towards the road. The dog's instincts guided him. He followed Connor's trail, ignoring the pain in his paws from stepping on sharp stones and sticks. The loyalty he had for his master was greater than any obstacle. Night fell completely, and Phil, tired and thirsty, finally found the scent he was looking for. Connor's familiar scent mixed with the smell of oil and burnt metal. When Phil arrived at the scene of the accident, his canine heart seemed to race. He saw the overturned car, the smoke rising slowly from the engine, and ran towards it. He started barking frantically, trying to attract attention, but the sound of the deserted road was his only company. Inside the car, Connor heard the barking. His eyes opened with difficulty, and he whispered, "Faithful?" The dog didn't wait any longer. He circled the vehicle, sniffing until he found a small opening in the broken side window. Sticking his snout and paws in, he began to pull out small pieces of glass and debris. Its paws scratched the metal as it tried to dig a path to Connor. "Faithful, you shouldn't be here," muttered Connor, the words barely audible. But Phil ignored any barriers. He continued, pushing hard until he managed to get partway into the car. Finding Connor's trapped leg, he began to gently pull at the fabric of his pants, trying to free him. Connor, weakened though he was, managed to support himself with Phil's efforts. Using the weight of his own body, he moved millimeter by millimeter until his leg was free. The pain was excruciating, but he knew he had to get out of there before it was too late. With the help of Phil, who was now pulling at his sleeve with his teeth, Connor managed to drag himself out of the vehicle. Outside, he collapsed on the damp grass, breathing hard. Phil didn't leave him for a second, licking his face as if to keep him conscious. Even wounded, Connor managed to mutter, "You saved my life, boy." But Phil didn't stop. He knew he needed more help. With one last look at Connor, he shot off down the road, running towards distant lights. A car was coming at him at high speed, and Phil positioned himself right in the middle of the road, barking desperately. The driver, startled, braked sharply and got out of the car. "What the hell? A dog?" said the man. But when he saw Phil's insistent barking, he followed him to the scene of the accident. Connor was almost unconscious when the driver arrived. The man called the emergency services and knelt down beside him. "Hang in there, buddy. Help is on the way." He looked at Phil, who was standing next to Connor, his eyes full of concern. "This dog is incredible." Minutes later, the ambulance arrived. While Connor was being placed on the stretcher, Phil tried to climb up next to him, but was gently pushed away by the paramedics. "He can't stay here, kid," said one of them. But Connor, weak as he was, protested, "He's coming with me. I'm not going without him." The paramedics exchanged glances, and seeing the determination on Connor's face, decided to allow Phil to accompany him in the ambulance. As the vehicle sped towards the hospital, Connor held Phil's hair with a trembling hand. "Thanks, kid. I'll never leave you again." Phil, lying next to him, just wagged his tail, satisfied that he was exactly where he should be, next to his owner. The white corridors of the hospital were a whirlwind of voices and movement when the ambulance arrived, but one sound in particular stood out: Phil's insistent barking, which accompanied the stretcher on which Connor was being carried. The paramedics, although surprised, had allowed the dog to remain nearby, impressed by the bravery he had shown. Inside the hospital, a nurse tried to intervene. "Dogs aren't allowed in here," she said, approaching to pull Phil away, but the puppy, with an almost human determination, stood firm by Connor's side, emitting a slight warning growl. Connor, still weak, opened his eyes and muttered, "He stays. Please." The nurse hesitated, looking at Connor's exhausted face and then at the paramedics, who quickly explained the situation. Finally, she sighed and gave in. "All right, but he mustn't get in the way of the procedures." Phil was allowed to continue to the nearby waiting room, where he would be under the supervision of a security guard. However, while the doctors and nurses tended to Connor, Phil remained restless, pacing in circles and peering through the closed door as if he could feel every moment of his owner's pain. Hours later, Connor was transferred to a recovery room. His leg was bandaged and he had several bruises, but according to the doctors, he had been lucky to escape with relatively minor injuries. As soon as he opened his eyes fully, his first question was, "Where is Phil?" The nurse smiled softly. "He's here at the hospital. I've never seen such a loyal dog. I'll go and get him." When Phil entered the room, pulled gently by a makeshift leash, it was as if a new energy filled the space. He ran up to Connor, licking his hands and wagging his tail so vigorously that he almost knocked over the tray next to the bed. "Hey, kid," said Connor with tears in his eyes. "You saved me, you know that?" Phil lay down on the side of the bed, his head resting against Connor's hand, refusing to move. The two of them were together again, and nothing seemed to be able to keep them apart. Phil's behavior caught the attention of everyone in the hospital. Nurses came into the room just to see him. When patients heard about the dog who had rescued his owner, they asked to meet him. Phil became a sort of unofficial mascot, bringing smiles and hope to everyone who crossed his path. "This dog is incredible," commented one of the doctors as he passed through the corridor. "I've never seen anything like him." A few days later, when Connor began to regain his strength, he received an unexpected visitor, the man who had stopped on the road and called the ambulance. He entered the room with a curious and reverent look on his face. "You must be Connor," said the man. "My name is Patrick. I was on the road that night. Your dog, he practically forced me to stop." Connor laughed weakly, stroking Phil. "He has this ability to convince you to do the right thing." Patrick looked at Phil with admiration. "I've never seen such loyalty. You're lucky to have him." "I know," replied Connor, his voice breaking. "But I think I'm the one who doesn't deserve a dog like him." At the hospital, Phil continued to impress everyone. He refused to leave Connor's side, even during the quietest moments of the night. When Connor fell asleep, Phil would stay alert, raising his head at the slightest sound or movement. Nurses would come into the room just to check that Phil was comfortable, bringing him water and blankets. "He's an inspiration to us all," a nurse told Connor one evening. "His recovery has been fast, but I think part of that is because he's here with you." Connor nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. He knew that Phil was much more than a dog. He was his savior, his companion, his family. When the day finally came for him to be discharged, Connor left the hospital in a wheelchair, pushed by a young nurse. Phil walked beside him, her tail swaying gently. At the exit, a small crowd of staff and patients gathered, waving and smiling. "Take good care of him, Connor," shouted one of the nurses. "And come back to visit us," added another. As Connor was helped into the cab that would take him home, he looked at Phil and smiled. "Let's go home, kid. No leaving you behind this time." Phil climbed into the seat next to Connor, wagging his tail as he put his head on his owner's shoulder. The two of them were together again, ready to start again. Back in the apartment, the first thing Connor did was tidy up Phil's corner, making sure the dog's favorite blanket was clean and folded. As he cleaned up, he felt the watchful eye of Phil, who wouldn't leave him alone for a second. "I know what you're thinking, kid," Connor said with a slight smile. "You're trying to make sure I don't run away, aren't you?" Phil barked low, as if to answer in the affirmative. Connor laughed, but the laughter was soon replaced by a heaviness in his chest. He sat down on the sofa, with Phil by his side, and sighed deeply. "I almost destroyed it. I almost destroyed us both." The next few days were filled with reflection. With his leg immobilized and with little mobility, Connor became even more dependent on Phil. The dog seemed to understand his owner's limitations, always paying attention to his movements, even picking up small objects that Connor dropped. Meanwhile, Connor thought about what life with Phil really meant. He remembered the loneliness before he met him, the empty nights and the days that seemed to have no purpose. Now, with Phil around, everything seemed different. It wasn't just a question of companionship, but of responsibility and connection. One night, while trying to sleep, Connor had a vivid dream. He was in the park where he had abandoned Phil. In the dream, he saw him sitting there, looking at him sadly, but there was no judgment in his eyes. Instead, Phil was wagging his tail as if to say, "I'm still here." When he woke up, he felt a tightness in his chest. "I can't thank you enough for coming back, kid," Connor murmured, stroking the head of Phil, who was lying next to him. Months passed, and Connor's physical recovery was accompanied by an emotional transformation. He began to walk again, first with the help of crutches, and then without them. Faithful was always by his side, following every small progress as if it were a shared victory. With free time during his recovery, Connor started researching dog adoption and local shelters. He was surprised to discover how many dogs needed homes and how many owners faced similar dilemmas to the one he had faced. It was then that an idea began to form. He couldn't change the past, but maybe he could do something to make up for it. One day, Connor picked up his laptop and started writing an email to a local shelter, offering to volunteer. At first, he thought his contribution would be small, helping to walk the dogs or organize events. However, his involvement quickly grew. Inspired by Feel, he came up with the idea of creating an awareness campaign called Feel's Heart, dedicated to sharing rescue stories and the importance of responsible adoption. "What do you think, kid?" asked Connor, showing Feel the first draft of a digital poster. Feel barked and wagged his tail in approval. The campaign started small with flyers and social media posts, but quickly gained attention. Connor, motivated by his story with Feel, began attending events and adoption fairs, sharing how that little dog had transformed his life. "Taking care of Feel taught me that love isn't something you give when you're ready. Sometimes it's love that prepares us," said Connor in one of his first public presentations. Feel, always by his side, was the star of the campaigns. People came to meet him, enchanted by the story of the dog who had saved his owner, both physically and emotionally. Little by little, Connor began to realize that he had found not only a new passion, but also a purpose. He decided to go further, planning to found a shelter of his own, where he could help other dogs like Feel and connect more people with the joy of having a loyal companion. One spring afternoon, as Connor and Feel walked through the park where it all began, he stopped for a moment and looked up at the sky. "I think I finally get it, kid. You weren't just a stray dog that came into my life. You were the beginning of everything." Feel looked at him, wagging his tail as usual, and gave a little bark as if to agree.